Welcome to this week's lecture on the early schools of thought in criminology. Now that we've covered some introductory material on criminology, criminal justice, and crime, it's time to move into the actual theories that we're going to be exploring this term. So this week we'll be diving into philosophers and theorists from the classical school who believe that punishment is the best way to prevent crime because human beings will choose to behave in ways that help them avoid pain and deprivation. As we'll see in our course, most criminological, sociological, and psychological theorists would not necessarily fully align with the classical school and its notions of deterrence, but this approach to crime and justice is essential to our course because much of our criminal justice system still operates on the belief that punishment is an effective way to address crime and prevent new crime from occurring. Now, classical school theorists certainly did not invent the concept of punishment. Quite the contrary, they looked at societies in which punishment was brutal, often fatal, and completely disproportionate to the crime being addressed. And they wanted to rein in the use of punishment. They looked at punishment as a natural response to deviance and crime, as well as an effective means of social control, but felt that in order for it to be effective, it needed to be something that people could understand, anticipate, and buy into. So early thinkers and theorists that we now associate with the classical school believed that people are rational agents with free will who want to live in societies where behavior is governed by some kind of social contract. In other words, societies in which I promise not to harm you if you promise not to harm me, and in which the government promises to swoop in and protect us if someone does end up harming you or me. The person we most associate with the classical school is actually an Italian lawyer and politician named Cesare Beccaria. He lived in the 18th century. Beccaria wrote about many reforms to criminal justice, and he also gives us a foundational understanding of deterrence and the rationale for society's use of punishment. Justice and equality were very personal issues for Beccaria. Though he came from a wealthy family, Beccaria fell in love with and married a woman from the lower class, which caused his family to break ties with him for a short period. Now, during that time, Beccaria was kind of thrust into poverty with his new wife, and this no doubt caused him to see how differently poor people and wealthy people were treated in society. Diversity in treatment based on social class was just unacceptable to Beccaria. He wanted to see people treated equally after the commission of crime. In his mind, wealth and status should never be factors in how we determine someone's sentence or how we treat them in our formal systems of justice. And it was from this passionate belief in equality that we see many of his ideas about justice spring forth. Now, in his thinking about punishment, Beccaria came to believe that punishment can be effective at deterring new crime if three conditions are met. And these conditions are that the punishment must be swift. In other words, the offender must be punished as soon as possible after the commission of the crime, or they will be less likely to link their actions to their punishment, rendering the punishment less useful. Secondly, the punishment must be certain. In other words, in order for punishment to deter crime, people must believe that they will get caught committing the crime and that punishment will occur as a result. They have to have faith in forces and systems that enforce law within the society. If they don't, again, may not be as effective. And lastly, punishment must be severe. In other words, in order to prevent rational people from committing crime, the punishment for doing so must be serious enough to outweigh any potential benefits one may reap by breaking the law. So again, Beccaria didn't believe in disproportionate reactions to crime, but he did believe that that punishment had to be severe enough to deter behavior effectively. Beccaria also helped us understand the complexity of deterrence by breaking it down into two distinct concepts, specific deterrence and general deterrence. According to Beccaria, swift, certain, and severe punishment functions in two ways. It helps deter the offender from committing a similar act in the future. This is what we call specific deterrence. And it also helps deter otherwise law-abiding citizens from breaking the law in the first place by reinforcing the fact that offenders will be caught and punished for their actions. And this is known as general deterrence. Now, as I stated earlier, our current criminal justice system is in many ways rooted in theories and ideas we can trace back to the emergence of the classical school. However, it's not a perfect representation of it. For example, though our system is largely still punitive, Beccaria would hate our common practice of detaining people in jail for months and years before fully adjudicating their case. He would hate our practice of the death penalty. He didn't believe in it. And though I can't speak to how women, black and brown people were treated in the 18th century in Italy, a modern Beccaria would also frown upon examples of people being treated differently in our system due to their race, gender, or social class. In other words, though Beccaria did much to reform and modernize the practice of justice, many of his ideas really have yet to be fully realized in our society. Jeremy Bentham is also an important figure to discuss in relation to the classical school, as he is known for bringing many of Beccaria's ideas to England. Now, Bentham was a philosopher best known for utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a philosophy rooted in the belief that human decision making is heavily influenced by our shared desire to generate pleasure and prevent pain. So, in a nutshell, it asserts that good decisions are those that give pleasure to the greater number of people or prevent pain in the greater number of people. Now, Bentham didn't write a lot about crime and justice per se, but he did focus a lot on law, deterrence, and human decision making. Like Beccaria, Bentham believed that humans are rational beings that make decisions by weighing potential risks against potential rewards. He referred to this as the hedonistic calculus. In Bentham's mind, punishment contributes to social order by influencing the hedonistic calculus. In other words, it works by linking the threat of pain to certain behaviors in order to prevent those behaviors. As the ideas of people like Beccaria and Bentham caught on and more societies implemented them into their practices concerning law and justice, some issues started to arise and some important questions began to emerge. Remember that Beccaria believed that everyone who commits a specific crime, such as homicide, should be given the same punishment. In theory, this made sense to a lot of people, but in practice, people started to think, oh, now wait a minute, shouldn't intent be a factor? Shouldn't criminal history be a factor? Should the person who killed someone by accident really receive the same punishment as the person who killed someone on purpose? Coming from his utilitarian point of view, Bentham believed that when creating new law, society should make sure that those laws produce the greatest good for the majority or the greatest number. Again, in theory, this sounded good to folks, but in practice, people started to kind of question it. Now, again, wait a minute. Shouldn't the rights of individuals be protected through law, even if by doing so we bring pain to the majority? Shouldn't the law protect the minority? These critiques of classical school ideas led to the emergence of what we refer to as the neoclassical school. Now, the neoclassical school did not deviate from the classical school when it came to how human beings make decisions. Theorists aligned with the neoclassical school absolutely believe that people are rational actors and that punishment is therefore an appropriate response to criminal behavior. However, while people like Beccaria believed that sentences should be determined solely by proving what crime had been committed, people in the neoclassical school believed that we should consider aggravating and mitigating circumstances when deciding how to punish a criminal offender. In other words, the offender who shows no remorse should be punished more harshly than the offender who expresses guilt and grief. And the offender with the long criminal history should be punished more harshly than the first-time offender. And the offender with the low IQ who was perhaps influenced by others to break the law should be given a softer sentence than the person with the average IQ who knew exactly what he was doing and that what he was doing was wrong. Compared to the classical school, the neoclassical school is a better representation of how we do criminal justice in our society today. Though this changes more and more every day, we still tend to emphasize punishment over other approaches to justice, such as rehabilitation and restorative justice. However, we like to consider the circumstances of a case when we're determining how to respond to someone's crime. This approach certainly causes more disparities in our sentencing, which Beccaria would frown upon, but it also shows an evolution in our understanding of what is truly fair when it comes to criminal justice and the rendering of punishment. That sometimes what is equitable in the eyes of justice is not equal or the same among victims, offenders, and their cases. While we see the rise of the classical school in the 18th century, as well as its evolution into the neoclassical school, in the 19th century we see thoughts about crime and justice continue to evolve. And with this continued evolution comes the positivist school. Now, positivists are stark opposites to classicalists in that they believe that people do not have free will, even in cases when the person acting believes that they do. Positivists believe that biological, psychological, and environmental forces determine behavior, and that even when we think we are making a decision freely, that decision is actually heavily influenced by factors other than logic. The positivist school is also distinct in that it moves criminology out of the realm of philosophy and into the realm of science. Put simply, positivists believe that crime is caused by something. And so they emphasize the role of the scientific process to help us uncover and address those causes. Now, by today's standards, early positivism can make all of us cringe, especially when we look at its connections to the eugenics movement. While someone like Lombroso is admirable in his insistence that policy and research should be in relationship with one another, he and others around this time inarguably twisted that relationship to pursue specific ends. Lombroso and other early positivists believed that criminality was innate and that some people were biologically inferior to other people, especially non-white people and people with low intelligence. Now, while I believe early positivists deserve some credit for moving criminology away from philosophy and into science, they also represent just how dangerous it can be when research is used to create specific outcomes and pursue specific ideologies. In other words, they remind us how important it is for researchers to maintain neutrality and keep a professional distance from the agendas of policymakers. Research should certainly help policymakers create the best policies, programs, and practices, but research should not be manipulated in order to lend legitimacy to harmful ideas and initiatives, especially those that hurt marginalized or dominated people. It's ideally best when research is used to test theory by people who are genuinely curious and open about what the results will be. Though many of these early positivist theories and ideas were guided by racism and other oppressive and ignorant perspectives, they did begin the journey that has led to a better understanding of the limits of free will and the role of the brain and body in temperament, behavior, and decision making. We still have a lot to understand about biology, the human brain, and crime. And so in many ways, people like Lombroso opened doors to rooms we're still exploring in our effort to understand harm and violence in our societies.